हेलो, नमस्कार, सलाम। एसएमई स्ट्रीट व्यू पॉइंट में आपका वेलकम है। आज काफ़ी एक्साइटेड हैं टू हैव अ गेस्ट, अ यंग प्रोफेसर who is an authority in some of the economic issues at the macro level as well as at the micro level. तो आज हम बात करेंगे मिस्टर दीपांशु मोहन से, जो कि प्रोफेसर ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स हैं, डीन हैं आइडियाज़ और ऑफिस ऑफ इंटरडिसिप्लिनरी स्टडीज़ एट ओपी जिंदल ग्लोबल यूनिवर्सिटी में। इसके साथ साथ ही इज़ ऑल्सो विजिटिंग प्रोफेसर इन लंदन स्कूल ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स। दीपांशु हमें ये हमारे ऑडियंस को इस पॉडकास्ट के थ्रू उन टॉपिक्स पे, उन एस्पेक्ट्स पे अपनी राय रखेंगे जो कि हमारी ओवरऑल इकोनॉमिक परफॉर्मेंस मैक्रो लेवल एज वेल एज एट द बिजनेस लेवल, जो हमें फैक्टर्स जो हमें इन्फ्लुएंस कर रहे हैं, ये अपनी राय रखेंगे, अपनी ओपिनियन रखेंगे, अपनी अंडरस्टैंडिंग हमसे शेयर करेंगे, जिससे कि हम कहीं ना कहीं जो ग्लोबल इकोनॉमी में जहाँ इंडियन एमएसएमई पहुँच सकती है, उस रोड मैप को, ग्लोबल इकोनॉमी के इश्यूज़ को समझते हुए हम अपनी जर्नी को किस तरीके से आगे पहुंचा सकें। दैट्स द बेसिक पर्पस।
I'm so happy to be here and thank you for the opportunity.
Yes. So to begin with, as an interdisciplinary economist, how do you see the role of economic history and culture? You know, if we actually look at what the contemporary trends are, how all of this is shaping the modern economics, especially modern economic policies, and the fast, in this fast pace of evolutionary process which we are going through, especially in the Indian context.
Yeah, so one of the critical things of looking at the economy is to see it as a product of complex network effects. By network effects, because we are talking about an economy that composes of human beings interacting with each other. Predominantly, the basing of economics as a discipline is that of a social science. To a lot of people, it is recognized as a dismal science, which uses sometimes a lot of complex mathematical equations to get across its point. The use of models, for example, as a methodological tool in economic sciences, is often also over emphasized in terms of its application. The larger purpose is to determine cause, study the effects of what is happening across the world. There are certain definitely technical aspects of the economy, like finance, the functioning of markets, the functioning of policy guidelines in context to what and how we experience our lives on a day-to-day basis. So to talk about economics or the economy being distant or distanced from anything that we do as part of an individual being or as part of a social being in any society would be a mistake. Where economic history as a field, I think, comes is in context to looking at the economy in times of cycles. The word business cycle, which is very often used in talking about financial cycles, helps us understand what aspect of the financial cycle one is experiencing by looking at, let's say, the movement of credit, the movement of money, the trends in variables or trends of what we call as inflation or the rise in prices, how quantity demanded is changing. So those aspects are all cyclical, as so are our lives. So a lot of one of the interesting thing that your listeners might find very intriguing is that the mathematics that we use for economics is not a mathematics that was sort of born or designed for economic sciences. It predominantly is mathematics for physics, which helps us understand our world, the world around us.
Exactly.
So in context to looking at even economic sciences and the context in which we function, those cycles are very important. So what the field of economic history does is in many cases help us the positioning of where we are currently, but also see us as products of our own past. We have a better understanding of what we look at in previous context where similar disruptions, for example, one of the biggest disruption we're seeing right now is in the area of technology, what
Hmm.
AI and not just artificial intelligence but robotics, the use of extensive use of data, machine learning. A lot of this is reorienting. So for a lot of people, this is something which is going to completely redefine the species. Its own networks, in the way it interacts. The
Exactly.
last of such, I think, magnitude of change that was seen was with the advent of internet, and then
Hmm.
before that maybe with the advent of sound, and
Hmm.
earlier industrialization, we would look at steam engine. So every cycle of maybe 30 to 40 years or 50 years has seen a huge change in terms of a disruption happening as a result of human beings advancing by bringing new technologies. So we are experiencing, and certain scholars call this as the fourth or the fifth industrial revolution in that sense.
Exactly.
So where do we really look at in terms of context to place our positions and be better prepared to adapt to change?
Hmm.
And one of the ways of doing that, as economic historians do, is to look at the past and how societies evolved, changed, shaped, reconciled.
Hmm.
In certain cases, also how
Hmm.
conflicts, emotions, interactions changed. And I don't see that there is a lot of precedence in terms of what is happening right now, but clearly you can go back in the past to see and understand how human beings respond to technological disruptions. Of course, the context of the current scenario is very unique. It has no precedent in, at least I would say, in technological or economic history, as a certain kind of technology what AI is doing. But I would see that more as a enabling effect, of knowledge or complex knowledge systems. One of the biggest impacts we are seeing of that is in case of manufacturing sector itself. A
Hmm.
lot of the manufacturing work is now being completely in the hands of very capital intensive robotics. One big example we have in front of us in our own lived experience is the automobile sector. The manufacturing of cars now no longer has um, an impact of using skilled labor, but rather use of robotics, which has replaced that. So how do we make sense of all of these things require not just an interdisciplinary perspective, but one which has a knowledge of history, geography, trade, and I would say complex ecosystems, which economies are all part of.
Absolutely, absolutely, very well. Thought that you have presented on the evolution of this economic growth. Um, when we actually talk about the MSME sector, which is considered to be one of the one of the core, at the center of the fulcrum is what the MSMEs are. When we actually look at them, definitely it is very important to understand that yes, changes are needed. According to you, because you understand the economic cycle and the growth, the curve much better. What structural changes, according to you, are essential for the MSME sector in order to thrive in the global competitive, tech-driven, environment?
So, I mean, looking at the Indian context right now, the MSME sector has been clearly struggling, and the evidence of that we have is of the last 8 to 9 years. I mean, particularly since demonetization 2016, I would say the MSME sector has been struggling for cash flow problems. It's one of the sectors which relies extremely, uh, in a major sense, on non-institutional formal forms of credit systems. So a lot of the finance that you have in the MSME sector is the access to credit is not from official formal sources, and so the dependency on cash has been integral in its sort of day-to-day governing dynamics, not for only just working capital needs, but for its functioning. So I think the sort of the biggest, I would say, attack or bolt or jolt that came to the MSME landscape in India was with demonetization. And then following up from that, there has been a cascading effect of crises, some I think induced by external factors. I mean, who would have imagined we would face a pandemic or have issues with respect to lockdown, which is what wrecked and I would say completely destroyed what was left of the MSME segment. Yes, the government I think tried in its limited capacity fiscally to provide credit guarantees and do undertake all of those measures. But I think what the MSME sector has failed to sort of really recover and sort of discover itself from that pre 2016 period is in terms of creating the same number of jobs that it was creating for what you would consider as a hugely mobilizing and structurally advancing workforce. So, in India's context, as your listeners would know, I mean, two-thirds of India's workforce is in the rural areas. So, the major jobs that those migrating out of rural areas would have would be in either construction or in the MSME sector, which is what creates and absorbs more entirety of the migrating labor force. So the MSME sector has not been able to absorb that extensive amount of workforce, which has put a lot of pressure on construction related jobs, which has been also in its own sense have been facing capacity utilization issues. And there are, I mean, I would probably say that there are five key components in looking at the larger MSME crisis at large. There are skilling gaps, which is in context to what the educated workforce is producing versus what the market needs, what the industry needs. A lot of this has to do with what I was talking earlier about the nature of technological change, but skill gaps have been spoken about for I think now over 2 decades in India, uh, because of a lack of sufficient state capacity to invest in research and development outside services. I mean, services like tech, information technology, those had massive R&D investments by MNCs, but we haven't seen MSMEs. I mean, to give you an example, areas like textile sector, which offers tremendous opportunities
Hmm.
in terms of both workforce participation, but also in terms of looking at meeting to the global demand of apparel manufacturing, has clearly struggled for a very long time. You have then chemical products, food processing, automotive sectors, all of these that within the MSME landscape have generated a lot of jobs. So there have been issues there on skilling. The other issue, as I mentioned earlier, was on credit gaps. So to formal finance, I think if based on the last, I think data point I was aware, there is a gap of roughly 20 to 25 lakh crore of formal finance limitations and needs. Even though, I mean, between the last 4 years, you've seen that more micro and small enterprises have access to credit through scheduled banks, but it is still, I mean, my sense is it's less than 20 to 25% overall, which means there's a lot of credit gap that remains. And this is a big issue because the nature of credit given is dependent on the amount of debt that MSME sector accumulates, and it's because of higher debt that its ability to invest in newer capacity is restricted. This is why micro or small firms will remain micro or small. The idea is to not enable them to make them micro and small and then allow them to scale up.
And one more thing is, like, I mean, excess of credit is definitely one thing which a lot of efforts are being made, but the cost of credit is also something
Or yeah, yeah.
which needs to be looked upon.
Yeah, so I was coming to that. So the other issue is which is what banks have been facing, right? So we know that the banks have been facing what in economics we call as a twin balance sheet problem, which is banks are finding it difficult to lend out good credit because they have a lot of debt on their balance sheet. So till the time they cannot do away with that debt, giving around new credit becomes ineffective. There's a lot of with IBC and NCLT, a lot of issues that came up with banks, particularly public sector banks, becoming more and more skeptical in giving new credit. Now, the other issue is that when banks become willing to give more credit, a lot of the MSME, firms may not be in the ability or capacity to take that credit and produce or manufacture to that level, which was telling us that there were demand side shortages and issues. And that's a third big challenge which I feel that the MSME sector faces, that the low middle income community or middle income group, which has been clearly struggling with a lot of consumption side issues on demand and price. um, the ability of the MSME sector to successfully operate is on a robustly functioning middle class in India. And the middle class in India has not been consuming at the same level, particularly in urban areas, because of price rises, because of supply side shortages and issues over the last few years. And for a lot of people, I mean, the pandemic or COVID was that big disruptor, but I feel that a lot of these issues were there in the economy even prior to COVID. There was evidence of a consumption side slowdown, which was beginning to look at. I mean, if you look at the sale of passenger vehicles, or you would look at the sale of tempos, trucks, it was declining, and that was showing us clearly stress on the side of producers. And a lot of those have direct linkages. I mean, the MSME sector is a small sort of a wheel in the larger manufacturing landscape. Then you have, I think, what I would consider as two big issues, which is on the nature of technological gaps, which is that the state policy and government's own national policy has not really, I mean, I would say, given enough importance to MSME over big manufacturing. There's been a huge impetus to attract big capital, large capital through existing, conglomerates or oligarchic, capitalist classes. So you have big business houses given a lot more of, leeway in policy design versus
But
giving
there are policies, there are
that
policy flagship policies which are like
that
the
they have been given.
Atmanirbhar
Yeah,
Bharat
yeah.
and champions, MSME champions, and so there are efforts which government is
Yeah.
making.
So what I wanted to mention, that the policies that you see that have been announced, which have nomenclaturally or a rhetorical tone to move towards boosting manufacturing in context to MSMEs, have required a lot of impetus at a decentralized level. No, so in MSME's case, you also need states to go ahead with what the center is planning. And because there has been, in certain cases, I mean, to give you a very good example, a state like Tamil Nadu has done very well in attracting greater manufacturing capital, unlike many other states which have struggled. I mean, you have a situation of Maharashtra, which in the 90s was booming in manufacturing. Then in 2000s you had Gujarat. Now you have, what you would see is Tamil Nadu, with the same amount of impetus. So there are certain states which have done well, but at the same time, a lot of this national level impetus has rung hollow with the state government policy design. And this, I think, has been as a result of not just conscious policy choice, but also because the market has been changing. The market is no longer the same in terms of manufacturing impetus, and the competitiveness level of MSMEs in India has been extremely low compared to what it competes with. And now we have, with the redesign of trade deals, not just
Yeah.
with the US, now we have a new FTA with the UK.
Yes,
So
so
this will be an issue.
it has to be, aligned with the contemporary trends, what you see, the global, how the global landscape is evolving, the global policy
Absolutely.
landscape is evolving. It has
Absolutely.
to be in line.
Absolutely. So competitiveness level is key. I mean, that I feel is, with the MSME sector, this been a larger challenge. It has, I would say probably there are challenges in history. I mean, in not political and political economy, history tells us that we protected our MSME sector for too long, for too
Hmm.
long a period,
True,
and that
true.
that actually made the situation of the MSME sector to struggle. But because we had like in automobile and semi-automotive component parts, electronics. I mean, electronics is a big area which is really booming now.
There are, for example, with respect to the recent FTA with UK, there will be provision of bringing the, investments from UK companies. On the other side, there will be, I mean, I'm sure we'll have an in-depth analysis of that, but the initial analysis or initial understanding goes like, UK companies can also can sell easily in India, can sell, as like a lot of, policy hurdles are going to get erased. So do you see all of this going to impact positively, or MSMEs, how is it going to impact on the Indian MSME sector? What are the, changes they should actually consider?
So I mean, of course, it's too early to say. I mean, the any free trade agreement that India has naturally benefited out of so far has been sectorally limited to services.
Hmm.
I haven't seen much that has really gone well, except in the 90s when we had the manufacturing FDI sort of policies in cases of electronics and automobile. The hybrid sort of presence of technology of Hyundai or a Suzuki coming in allowed Maruti or a Hero Honda kind of so that is the perfect amalgamation of technology and scale, which the market of India offers a lot of scale,
Hmm.
uh, but it doesn't offer a lot of skill, uh, which is where I think China was that big change for the larger MSME space in the 2020 21st century. But
Hmm.
going to the specifics of what you're asking, I would say that sectors which are relatively more competitive
Hmm.
in the regional or international market would not have that much of an impact. So I would expect that areas like textile have a lot of scope to grow. There is a huge demand, and some of the areas within textile and exports have been doing reasonably well.
Hmm.
You can see now any major multinational retail brand sourcing extensively now from India. So
Hmm.
which is one of the spaces where you can expect things to grow, provided
Hmm.
the nature of investment is in those sectors. But where my concern is in terms of our vulnerable uh, sectors. There are also sectors in MSME which are very much vulnerable to foreign trade and competition. Investment will always find a more profitable route, but we
Hmm.
have to be very cautious that which sectors or which spaces within MSME require safeguarding. And I think those safeguarding are very critical. I mean, like agricultural sector, like dairy uh, processing or agro processing, uh, are areas which we are very vulnerable in. They are directly linked to a very exacerbatedly vulnerable farming network. So there are those spaces where in agro processing, I would say, while there is a huge scope for investment. I mean, of course, there's no doubt that there is more scope for investment, but the degrees of vulnerability have to be also assessed. So I think FTA is a good route. Free trade agreements give you a lot more leverage in prioritizing, but it has to be carefully wedged between the state of growth.
Yeah, one thing, Dipanshu, I wanted to understand from you, like with the kind of such knowledge that the Indian education, and Indian education is young education is like you possess carries. So how do you see? And we also talk about industry academia partnership in order to produce better output. So how do you see education institute like yours can probably contribute in the overall entrepreneurial development, can improvise the level of policy making, can contribute positively in the area of entrepreneurial productivity.
So, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges we really face at the level of skilling, on the skilling gaps that, I mean, which we see in MSME, but also in broadly within India, is on the state of crisis in higher education. A lot of that has to be linked with uh, the fact that we have almost 70% of our higher education dependence on private universities and institutions, which has its own problems of access, equity, and challenges there. It's important to mention it because if bulk of your population is not able to access quality education, then the gaps that you're talking about within both academy, I mean, a lot of the academic discourse of knowledge we are imparting, even in sciences, is pretty outdated to the nature of scenarios that we are looking at. But in private institutions, in private elite institutions, the scenario is very much up to date with market expectations, which is why there is a tendency for a lot of people to compete for those seats in private sector. So what can be done? I mean, one of the avenues which is being explored by institutions like, which I would say at a very minuscule stage, the ISB model, which really came up and allowed for entrepreneurship capital to develop and grow, requires, of course, a lot more of scaling up. I would definitely say that the way in which IITs and IIMs expanded, while it was the need for, again, a scaling up need for these institutions to reach every corner within India, but the quality enhancement did not happen at the same level. So you still have IIM Ahmedabad, Calcutta, and Bangalore to be the three main premier institutions for management studies. The MBA revolution in India somehow has sort of now tapered down because of the lack of jobs that a lot of MBA graduates have. In fact, the higher the level of education, the higher the possibility of being jobless is what the scenario is right now. I mean, when I say jobless, I'm saying in terms of expectations of what your employment is based on the degree you have done. But there is a lot of, I mean, I would say there's a lot of potential in design. There's a lot of potential in what you'd consider as creative interdisciplinary programs. You have, I mean, within our own university, I see that there's a lot of focus on data sciences, AI. Those programs are training a lot of focus. So that is being sort of given a lot of, I would say, space. So one of the other big challenges that you would see, sorry, yeah. So one of the other challenges with education that you see is that most of these degree programs that are trying to cater to the needs of the market by teaching more about new technologies or providing new entrepreneurial capabilities is very much restricted to those elite institutions. So this will not have a scale mask effect, I mean, as a positive spillover. So to answer your question in context to the middle income class, there is a disenchantment or a disillusion of the middle income class in studying, for example, for higher education needs in India. Now, there's a huge impetus of migrating to different countries. I mean, UK, Canada, and Australia have uh, attracted the most amount of Indian students in the last few decades. But these numbers are outrageously high. I mean, I've been looking at the data from 2020. If you see 2020, 2021, 2022, the volume of students applying for programs have significantly gone up. And then you have migration and immigration related challenges in these host countries. So the challenge in higher education is a very complex and peculiar one. I feel we have lost the bus there completely. I mean, and to be more, I mean, less optimistic about the scenario, I feel that the nature of challenge is so huge that you can start with few institutions which can try. There are models, of course, as I said, ISB is a model, but there are also models within IIMs that, through better practice, ensured that amount of education which had focus on entrepreneurial training. But the point that you made, which I feel on entrepreneurial development, is the way forward also, because the expectation of jobs coming out from a government facility or an MNC investment, that model has to change. And I think that it is changing, but a lot of other factors have to also weigh in.
Hmm. Hmm. Perfect. So thank you so much, Deepanshu, and I'm sure we should have more conversations like this. And this itself is a very interesting, insightful session. I'm sure our listeners would have very good takeaway from this conversation. And thank you so much for giving time. And we should have more conversations like this. And the points you have mentioned are pretty important and is a fair critical analysis also. Having said that, um, but the potential of Indian MSMEs is something which is really um, promising, which has proved itself in past, and with the knowledge and yes, challenges ahead, but we will come out. I'm sure we will come out with all the challenges getting defeated.
Absolutely. No, and as I said, we have models within our own MSME sector, which, I mean, retail on textiles have been doing brilliantly well. Electronics hardware is a sector which we had almost, I would say 15 years back, abandoned, which has now really started to pick up. There's a lot of focus on semiconductor
Yes.
manufacturing, which the UP and the state of UP has recently got. I think Foxconn is investing
Hmm.
in that. So those are good signaling effects. But
Hmm.
along with those signaling effects, I think the proportional investment in human capital
Yes.
development, which I mean, any steady rate of growth in any economy is a function of how well we are doing in training the human capital potential. So as instructors and as teachers, we are invested in that process. So thank you for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. तो जैसा आज हमने इस पॉडकास्ट में सुना यंग प्रोफेसर को, जिनकी अपनी ओपिनियन है, जिनकी अपनी अंडरस्टैंडिंग है, अपने एक्सपीरियंस और अपनी नॉलेज के दम पे, दीपांशु ने हमें इंटरडिसिप्लिनरी इकोनॉमिक ट्रेंड्स के बारे में बताया। उन्होंने बताया हमें कि हम एमएसएमईज़ को क्या करना चाहिए और जो कि अपने अपने होराइज़न को वो एक्सपैंड कर सकें। ग्लोबल इकोनॉमिक सिनेरियोज़, इंडियन इकोनॉमिक ट्रेंड्स, इन सब पे दीपांशु ने अपनी राय रखी। इट्स अ वेरी क्लियर ओपिनियन विच ही हैड मैनेज टू प्रेजेंट। एट द सेम टाइम हमने ये भी बात करी कि कैसे एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशंस ये पब्लिक प्राइवेट पार्टनरशिप में अपना रोल अदा कर सकते हैं, और किस तरह से एक एकेडमिक इंस्टीट्यूशन, एक एमएसएमई और एक पॉलिसी प्लेटफॉर्म और पॉलिसी मेकर नेटवर्क, ये मिल करके हमारी इस सोसाइटी में एमएसएमई के लिए अपना रोड मैप आसान कर सकते हैं। इन तमाम चीज़ों पे हमने बात करी, और हम चाहेंगे कि आज हमारी ऑडियंस अपने इस पॉडकास्ट को समझे, और इस पॉडकास्ट से रिलेटेड जो भी उनका फीडबैक हो वो हमें शेयर करें, और SMEStreet.in पर हमारी इन डेप्थ एनालिसिस में पार्टिसिपेट करें। SME स्ट्रीट व्यू पॉइंट जो हमारा यूट्यूब इंटरफेस है, उस पर अपना पार्टिसिपेशन करें कमेंट्स के ज़रिए, और साथ ही साथ हमें ईमेल लिखें, हमको अप्रोच करें अगर किसी भी तरीके का क्लैरिफिकेशन उनको चाहिए अपने बिज़नेस को एक्सपैंड करने में, अपने बिज़नेस को नेक्स्ट लेवल पर ले जाने के लिए। वो उन चीज़ों पे जो उनको चैलेंजेस लग रहे हैं, वो हो सकता है हमारा जो नेटवर्क है, हमारे जो नॉलेज नेटवर्क है, उसके लिए वो चैलेंजेस मैनेजेबल हों। तो हम चाहेंगे कि आप हमसे पार्टिसिपेट करें और हमें अपनी इश्यूज़, अपने चैलेंजेस के बारे में बताएं, जिसका कि सॉल्यूशन हम ढूंढ सकें। थैंक यू सो मच। स्टे ट्यून्ड ऑन SME स्ट्रीट व्यू पॉइंट।